Let's take a moment to discuss the whole concept of hardware direct monitoring and the integration that we have through the ASIO Direct Monitoring Protocol in Studio One. A little bit confusing to say that out loud, but let's hop over to Studio One for a second over here, and I'm going to open up the preferences. And if we head to the Audio I/O setup and we scroll to the second tab, which is the processing tab, you'll see if we have either a Studio 192, Studio 192 Mobile, or any PreSonus interface that supports the Hardware Direct Monitoring Protocol, then you'll notice that we have the option to deselect this preference over here, which is use native low latency monitoring instead of hardware monitoring. So currently I have this enabled, and as you can see, we have a green Z over here, and this is telling us that the audio round trip would be 21.3 milliseconds. It's worth mentioning that I currently have my device block size set to 256. If I lowered this, we would have an even lower figure over here. But let's put this back up to 256, and you're going to see why in a moment. So I'm going to go back to my processing tab over here, and let's go ahead and deselect this option. Now keep your eye on this low latency figure reporting that happens when I deselect this. Okay, a couple things happened. First of all, you'll notice that it changed from a green Z to a blue Z over here. Secondly, you'll notice that our low latency value is indicating around 0. This is because what's happening in the background is our inputs are being directly routed to our outputs. So they are merging with our DAW output, but essentially the latency I'm hearing is so low that it's almost imperceivable. It's only passing through the converters on the A to D and the D to A. So it's incredibly low, and that's why this is indicated as around 0 as a figure. Now, a couple notes when you're working with hardware direct monitoring mode within Studio One, otherwise known as Blue Z, is that any headphone routing that happens, we have to set up this headphone routing to be direct routing. So for example, when we're using native low latency monitoring, because this is the main outs and my headphone source is set to monitor the main mix, and seeing as we have a fader in universal control that's a DAW return, and that's routed to the main outs, that will monitor my main mix. But when we're using our Blue Z or hardware direct mode, we have to set up the direct routing in terms of using QSense. So let's open up our Audio I/O setup. And if you need a refresher on this, just hop back to the video that we did earlier in this playlist about configuring or customizing the Audio I/O setup. So I'm going to enable both HP1 and HP2. Keep in mind, these are direct routing or direct headphone buses that I'm enabling right now. Go ahead, click apply, and OK. Now let's view our outputs, and you can see I have outputs. I've got HP1 and HP2. Let's enable the hardware monitoring or hardware direct monitoring for both HP1, HP2, and also let's enable it for the main outs. So that would be if we weren't using any headphones at all, and we were listening to the main outs in the control room. Now that we have this set up and we have our headphone routing, the only thing that we need to do is we either need to monitor the channel or record enable the channel, and this would be depending on what type of recording workflow you're using. I typically like to use tape style monitoring, so if I'm using tape style monitoring, the only thing I have to do is record enable this channel, and as long as my input is set correctly, I'll be able to hear myself. But let's go ahead and do both. So now you can see that I am both monitoring this channel and it's also record enabled. Now the great thing about this is, just like I said, I literally have 0 latency, or as close to 0 latency as I've ever had in terms of working within a DAW. And for that particular reason, I happen to love the Studio 192 series interfaces, because if I'm tracking, regardless of whether I'm on a brand new system or an older system, I have next to no latency in my headphones, or for all intents and purposes, I'm going to call it 0 latency. Let's go back to our preferences over here. The other thing you'll notice is that regardless of my device block size, this figure of around 0, it does not change. So what that means is that we could literally have our device block size set to 512. And if I scroll over to my processing tab, you'll see we have the exact same figure here, around 0. Now this allows you to put very minimal strain on your system in terms of having a really, really solid low latency or incredibly low latency option to record with. Now, those are all the pros. So you might ask, what's the con? Well, the con is that we can't use any plugins natively on our inserts and be able to monitor through them when we're using a hardware direct monitoring workflow. Now, in terms of setting up sends for either reverb or delay, we can do that no problem, and that functions just as it normally would. But with respect to having a native insert on the actual channel, we wouldn't be able to hear any of that processing. But PreSonus have an answer to that. This is why we have the FAT channels. So you can see I have my audio device controls visible in my console over here. And you'll notice that we have this FAT channel over here. So this blue FAT channel, if I click this, you'll notice up top, Studio 192, Mic 3, onboard DSP. Now that's because this FAT channel GUI is actually directly linked to the controls that I have for this FAT channel on my input 3, which is what I'm currently using for my talkback mic. So if I was to go ahead and engage a high pass filter, it's engaging the high pass filter on this particular track over here. Now the other thing we can do is simply click, hold, and drag this to the bottom, and this has now created a linked native version of the FAT channel that's residing on these controls, meaning that if I was to record anything and play it back, that it would be playing back with the exact same settings that I have on my DSP FAT channel. So we wouldn't have this jagged workflow where we're hearing two completely different sounds in terms of when we're tracking versus when our tracks are playing back. I currently have this high pass filter. Let's bring this back a bit. Just to kind of demonstrate this, I'm going to go over to the EQ, and we have a top end boost over here that's been engaged. Maybe we could dip out some mids as well and bring something up here. So this is a very different sound than I had in terms of being a flat sound. Now on the DSP version, I'm monitoring through this right now. I'm going to go ahead and just run some recording over here just so we can listen back. So now on the DSP side of things, I'm going through this plugin, and this is putting zero strain on my system. You can see if I was to open up my performance monitor over here, just move this out of the way and bring this down, I don't have any hit on my CPU because all of this processing that I'm currently hearing in my headphones is happening on the DSP version. Let's go ahead and push stop. Now, if I go ahead and engage playback and I switch over to the native version, you'll see that the native version has the exact same settings. Let's take this out of monitor mode, run some recording over here just so we can listen back. So now on the DSP side so this allows us to have this linked plugin where we're linking the DSP version and the native version back. And if I was to go ahead and play this back and make any changes in this plugin, I've brought down these gain a little bit here, and perhaps I could even head over to the high pass filter and just engage the high pass a little bit. The exact same settings have happened on the Studio 192 DSP version of my FAT channel. So this is an incredibly powerful workflow because even though we can't monitor through native plugins, we can monitor through the standard FAT channel DSP version, and we can link these two together so that any changes that happen on the DSP or the native are bidirectional and will update when made on either the DSP or the native plugin. Having said that, we do have one more type of workflow that we could do as well. So let's say, for example, you wanted to make some changes to your equalizer, and instead of saying to yourself, all right, I just want to monitor through these, you say, you know what, I'm feeling pretty good about this. I want to commit these sounds to tape. Well, let's say that it was a really high top end boost. I could simply go ahead over here and enable my apply DSP to input signal. And now what's going to happen is this is going to actually print this on the input and render this into the file. So now if I was to go ahead and record, I could go ahead and I'm tracking and I'm actually printing these effects into the signal. So if you know exactly what it is that you need to do, could be a little bit of EQ, maybe a little bit of compression as well. We'll switch to the compression tab over here, start bringing down my threshold. Anything that we start doing, now I'm triggering some compression over here, is actually printing through the audio file, and we can actually commit to this. Let's go ahead and just take this top end boost out for now. I don't really need to hear this, and I'm going to go back in and let's bring the low cut down. So the idea with this type of workflow when using the BlueZ or hardware direct monitoring is there's a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, we know that the minute we engage hardware direct monitoring, we have to set up a QMix for our headphones. In terms of our headphone 1, headphone 2, or any external amplifiers, they have to be enabled as a QMix output. Secondly, if we want to monitor through the onboard DSP FAT channel, but we don't want to commit to it, and we want any punch-ins that were happening or anything to happen to be seamless, we want to simply go ahead, make sure that we have enabled the Show Audio Device Controls option, and then simply drag and drop this into the section, and this will automatically create a native FAT channel that is linked to the DSP version. Conversely, we could also go ahead and just load this as we normally would. For example, let's go to our recents over here, and we could manually enable the link to DSP option. Now we know that any playback and any input monitoring that happens is going to match because these two plugins are linked. And then last but not least, we know we have the option to actually make changes to our signal in terms of adding some EQ, and then clicking this tab, Apply DSP to Input, will allow us to essentially print any of these effects that are happening. We can print them right to our audio performance. If we know that we need a little bit of compression and EQ, this is a very viable option to be able to use an analog style workflow where you're committing to your sounds and you're printing on the way in. So that's using the BlueZ or the hardware direct monitoring integration available within the Studio 192 and the Studio 192 Mobile when paired with PreSonus' own Studio One DAW.